Excellent. Thank you very much, Chip. As Chip said, happy Valentine's Day for everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I am the Fisheries Project Manager with the Nature Conservancy, but one thing I will say first and foremost is, as Chip alluded to, I am an angler. I started doing this because I love to fish. I want to keep fishing. I want my daughter to keep fishing, and I just love being out on the water. That said, we conducted this survey just over a year ago in cooperation with Responsive Management, who helped to administer the survey for a couple of reasons. Number one, we wanted to figure out, or at least attempt to figure out exactly who was using descending devices, if anybody had heard of them, if they knew how to use them, so on and so forth. And then also we wanted to really figure out a way to best direct our outreach, to figure out how it was that people got their quote unquote fishing information. You know, I know how I get it. I know how I got it from the time I was a kid, but not everybody certainly is like me. And we wanted to really start to learn the ins and outs of how most people went about learning what to do on the water. You are going to see a lot of charts and graphs. I apologize for that in advance. I wish there were some better pictures, but this is the nature of the beast with this. So that said, we'll get right into it. Presentation overview. Again, we'll go through the study methodology and then all the different things that I just discussed right now. The one thing I will leave out is familiarity with the Nature Conservancy, because this will be very specific to descending device outreach. The study was conducted in Florida and South Carolina. We did a multimodal survey of anglers, and we concentrated on people who had fished within the last 2 years in federal waters in 30 feet or deeper, which is most waters except for where I live, of course, which is Southeast Florida. We concentrated on some of the more popular species: black grouper, gag grouper, red snapper, mangrove snapper, mutton snapper, so on and so forth. And again, we wanted to ensure that the anglers were 18 years of old, had fished in the given state, and had fished for one of the species above. When I say multimodal, we did it both with online and via telephone. And then the dates that we conducted the survey below. We had 3 source samples. We collected data from the Florida Licensed Anglers Reef-Fishing Endorsement Database provided by FWC. Thank you very much for that. And then also we use a subcontractor of sorts called MSG, which is a firm that provides statistically valid samples for research data. That was for the South Carolina anglers. That data was a little bit more difficult to come by. Excuse me. And the internal sample, again, was maintained by Responsive Management. These sample sizes, we had just under 1,200 people from Florida, and then just about 449 people from South Carolina as respondents. Excuse me. And overall, Overall, we separated the anglers into people who fished in Florida and then anglers who also fished in South Carolina, and then we had some combined analyses as well, which you will also see. And then the survey did include head boat and charter captains, so it's you know, in the South Atlantic, that's all under one one sector, so we included those as well. So our first question was, have you ever noticed that some fish were physically unable to return to the water and had something known as barotrauma? We didn't call it barotrauma just yet. And as you can see, 63% of respondents in Florida had said that they did, 53% of respondents in South Carolina did. You're going to notice some themes, very similar statistical numbers in both states as we go through this. So almost all anglers surveyed said that they had released fish that they have caught, and then these anglers were asked these follow-up questions. Oops. Prior to the survey, have you ever heard of the term barotrauma? As you can see, 61% in Florida said yes, 44% in South Carolina said yes. Excuse me. And then we had just a few that didn't know whether or not they had ever heard the term. And then this is going to be a combination slide, so I won't spend too much on this. But percent of each of the following groups, and this includes some socioeconomic data, and really just a summary of a bunch of stuff that you're going to see here and throughout this presentation. And then the same thing for South Carolina. Again, it starts off with uses descending devices all the way down to some socioeconomic information and data that we wanted to collect as well. Prior to the survey, Have you ever heard the term barotrauma? And this is directly from Captain. 67% in Florida had said yes, 40 from South Carolina said yes. Again, you can see a little bit of separation there, but you'll see some of these statistics are fairly duplicative in the two areas. How much do you know about barotrauma in fish? And this is the one that is, I suppose in some ways it's good in that it helps us direct where our outreach really can concentrate. And you can see a large number of people had never heard of it, which isn't great for the survivability of the fish, but it does help us with our outreach and where we can direct it. You know, it's always that the people that know just enough to be dangerous are kind of sometimes the more difficult ones to talk to about this. And again, from this one, this is just the captains, and it's a very similar number, even with actually licensed charter captains. You can see 60% of the captains in South Carolina had never heard of it. 33% in Florida had never heard of it, of respondents. And then this one got it to help identify if some of these respondents could actually properly identify barotrauma in saltwater fish. And then you can see that the easy one, the floating and unable to submerge, of course, a lot of respondents, 85% and 72% respectively, were able to identify that. But then some of the less noticeable signs, like rapid breathing, cloudy eyes, the white spots on the skin or fins, flushed fins, things like that, were some of the more difficult signs to recognize. And of course, as such, we had lower number of participants that were able to identify those issues. Again, some of the more obvious signs, the bulging or bugged eyes, the bloating, swollen belly, things like that, most people were able to identify that, which is a good thing. How necessary do you think it is to help a fish? This was really good news, is that 76% of people said that it's very necessary, which is fantastic. Because that means that people are going to be open to any kind of outreach that we have, for the most part anyway, or you would think. And then we get into the awareness and use of venting and descending devices. Prior to the survey, did you know what venting was? And we did want to ask the question about venting, even though it's not part of the regulation in the South Atlantic. We did want to ask that question, and as you can see, quite a few people were aware of what venting was, 74% and 70% in South Carolina. And then we asked the descending device question, and obviously fewer people knew what a descending device was, which is not totally unsurprising, but a little disheartening at the same time. But again, this will really help us direct our outreach efforts. What we want to do is, you can see 60% knew about them in Florida, 55% in South Carolina. And then the sort of disheartening part of that was that 29% didn't know anything about it at all in Florida and 32% in South Carolina. Percent of each of the following groups who knew what a descending device was broken out. And again, this is includes some socioeconomic data in there as well, which we'll get into. You know, overall, the combined is about 64% of people that knew what it was. And then you can see the breakout there. It tended to skew male, higher income, and people that had heard of barotrauma knew what a descending device was. And very similar statistics for South Carolina. And if I'm going too fast, please, Chip, if you want to interrupt me or something. I know I tend to blow through this pretty quick, especially when it's just graphs and I don't get to look at cool fish pictures.
You're doing well.
Thank you. Prior to the survey, did you know that there was a regulation? As we say, Reg Amendment 29, a lot of times, 44% of respondents said that they did in Florida, 52% didn't know. And then you can see fairly similar numbers for South Carolina as well. 43% were aware of the regulation and 51% were not. And for those that don't know, Regulatory Amendment 29 is the regulation that requires having a descending device rigged and ready on a vessel that is fishing for snapper, grouper species in the South Atlantic, in federal waters. Hit the wrong button. And then this is a very similar question, but directed more at captains. This was a little surprising anecdotally, because a lot of captains that I've spoken to personally didn't know this, but The people that responded to the survey, 59% from Florida said that they did, 49% from South Carolina. And a little disheartening, you can see the fairly large number of people that admitted that they don't know, but are still professional captains. So it's still an issue as far as outreach goes, and making sure that everybody understands that this is something that is not just a requirement, but certainly necessary for the sustainability of the complex that we all love to partake in. Do you ever use a venting tool? This was obviously looking at venting tools versus descending devices. And if you compare the two, you can see that there's quite a gulf. A lot more people have admitted to using a venting tool as opposed to a descending device. We like to say that a venting tool is okay if you're not going to do anything else, but we would prefer we would prefer a descending device for any number of reasons. It's more effective, we found. It's healthier for the fish. It can be a lot more user-friendly, certainly a lot less dangerous too. There's enough sharp things floating around on a boat to have essentially a big hypodermic needle. Isn't always the best in line. But unfortunately, as you can see, 63% and 73% respectively from Florida and South Carolina said that they had never used a descending device, which again is a little disheartening, but does help direct us with where we want to go. Excuse me, this was a similar question, but again, directed at captains. The good side of this is that there are quite a few captains that do use venting tools. The bad side of this is you can see that there's quite a few captains that just don't want to use descending devices or haven't for whatever reason. And then we do get into that a little bit further down. But again, this is something where we really want to concentrate our outreach efforts, certainly in the professional community, if you will. And I just realized I used air quotes when I said professional that nobody can see, so I apologize for that. And again, including some of the socioeconomic data, percent of people who use descending devices that have heard of barotrauma, 46%. The age spectrum is about 35 to 54 years old was the most consistent, male, so on and so forth. And then South Carolina, very similar numbers. How frequently do you use a descending device? 39% and then 33% from Florida and South Carolina, as you can see, always use it. The unfortunate truth is that it seems to be an all or nothing type of thing. You can see the numbers of often or sometimes are pretty low. It's either you use them all the time or we never use them, which is a little disheartening, again, when we talk about the survivability of the species as we continue to partake in the resource. We'd love to move all those nevers into at least always and definitely at the very least often, if possible. What types of descending devices do you use? And this was, again, just for our knowledge, just almost a curiosity question. The weighted or inverted hook type devices, which is like the Shelton fish descender is an example of those. That was a fairly high percentile of people. And then the gripping or mouth tent devices like the sequelizer was another fairly high number. The weighted or basket crate we found tended to be more of a party boat or head boat type operation would use those. But again, this just shows the variety and variability of the different descending devices out there, and don't have to stick to one or the other. Excuse me. Which of the following best describes when you use a venting tool or descending device? And most of it is just when the fish shows obvious signs of barotrauma, and then some of them would be if you're fishing at a certain depth, which either of those two would be perfectly okay. Barotrauma can happen in as little as 30 feet. We typically see it in that 60-foot range or more is kind of the sweet spot. But either of those two we're thinking are a positive thing. And this is, again, just from people who admitted to using a descending device. So you can see those total respondent numbers reflect that. You indicated that if you've indicated that you have used both venting tools and descending devices, which one do you prefer? And then you can see the large majority preferred using venting tools. And this is without much outreach at the time. So, you know, a lot of people, if they were going to use one method or the other, they said that they preferred venting. And then we can get into that right here. Which do you prefer? And this is for venting. And the main reason was ease of use. Most people thought that descending devices were a little too complicated and took a little too much time. As you can see, those two answers towards the top there, both ease of use and venting is quicker. And then a few people thought that the efficacy of that method was better. But again, that's just something, really all of these are something that can easily be corrected with good outreach and education. So this was in some ways some good news for us because it's nothing that we can't work on. And then which do you prefer for bear trauma? And as you can see, the vast majority of people understood that this was actually a better method for fish revitalization for the sustainability of the fish itself. A few people said ease of use, but you can see the vast numbers lean toward just the efficacy that the people that did prefer a descending device understood that it's a better method for fish survival. And how can we encourage the use? This is where we really started to get into how we were going to engage with our outreach strategy. Excuse me. What would make using a descending device more likely when you're fishing for fish? And then most of the people said that they wanted something that was less complex or easier to use. A few people said less expensive or cheaper devices. And then again, this was mainly from party and head boats, but more help on deck, as you can understand. You know, when you're on a party boat, you've got 20, 30 hooks in the water, and having one or two mates to try to descend 10 or 15 fish sometimes isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. But it was interesting that the less complex, easier to use was the top respondent there. Wasn't what I hypothesized, but that's okay. Again, it helps us direct where we want to go with our outreach and where we want to concentrate our education efforts. Excuse me. And this goes into a little bit of detail for somebody that responded to that question. Is there anything else that would make you more likely to use a descending device when you caught and released a fish? If yes, what? And then that's where we talk about the more information, better education about it. Again, this is great for us because it really helps to get at the heart of where we want to direct our outreach and what we're trying to do for the complex. Information sources. This is, as I had spoken about in the beginning, where you go to get your fishing information, if you will. And quite a large majority said from friends, family, or word of mouth. A few people did respond from license information. This related a little bit more to regulations, by the way, not necessarily just about fishing information in general. And then, as you can imagine, of course, in the modern age, you know, internet searches, search engines, and then online angler groups was also a fairly high number. But the sort of old school trope of fishing, you know, it's word of mouth and friends and family where they're going to get most of their information and guidance for things like this. You can also see in there, charter head boat captain operator was ranked fairly high. That surprised me a little bit, but probably shouldn't have. But again, this helps really decide where we're going to lead our outreach efforts and how to better engage the community at whole. Excuse me. And I just blew through that a lot quicker than I thought I would. So I will take any questions, comments, concerns, and answer them as best I can.
Thank you for the presentation, David. I'm going to take back control.
Okay.
All right. Once again, in order to ask a question, you can just raise your hand clicking on this icon that is looks like a drawn hand. Once it turns red, that's indicating that your hand is raised. When it's your turn to ask the question, I'll unmute you and the webinar will let you know that you've been unmuted. In order to speak, make sure this little red icon that's a microphone, make sure that turns green. That'll indicate that you're ready to speak. If you don't want to speak out loud, you can also ask or type your question into the question box, and I'll read that aloud for you. With that, we have quite a few hands already raised. I will start with Laura Lee. All right.
Hey, David. Nice job on presenting that data. I participated in the MREP training in November, and when we were at the NOAA headquarters, I saw a video that made a believer out of me. And it was it started out with a big grouper. His tongue was stuck out of his mouth. His scales were standing on end. Obviously, a very badly barotraumaed fish. And the video showed them hooking up the descending device, and it followed the fish down to the bottom. And you could literally see in this video, without using a venting tool or anything, that as the fish went down, its tongue went back into its mouth, and its scales went back to where they were supposed to be. And when it got down near the bottom, it was released and it swam away. That video, I think, would do more than anything else in trying to educate people. Seeing is believing. So, if there's a way, I don't know, if it's feasible to get little mini television so you could just loop that video in some of the bigger bait and tackle stores that are close to the ocean. But my comment is that video, I think, would do more than anything that you could do to make people understand the value of descending devices.
Thank you for that, Laura Lee. Yeah, I know the video very well. It's with the red grouper. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that video, when I show people that video, whenever I'm doing any kind of speaking engagement or anything like that, it's like their eyes glaze over for most of what I'm saying. And then when they see that video, it's like opening up a whole new world to them. And you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that we've spoken about as we engage with what we call, fishing influencers in the fishing community, is to try to show, and we're actually in the process of trying to get a couple more of those videos, but to try to utilize that footage as much as possible, because it really does. It makes a believer out of so many people.
It's amazing, and then the influencers could send it out to their followers, but the more you can get that video out, I think the better it'll be. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, Ashley Oliver.
Hey, David. Thanks again, or thanks for just a great presentation as always. Always love listening to you. Do you guys have plans for maybe another survey, even to encompass the entire South Atlantic region? If so, what differences do you think you'd make in the survey?
We do. I'd be lying if I had an actual date for it, though. I'm not going to lie, COVID kind of put a crimp in a lot of plans. We were actually going to do this survey back in 2020, and then it got delayed by almost a year and a half. And then we would love to do the rest of the South Atlantic. And again, I'd be lying if I didn't say that funding was an issue. So yes is the easy answer. I don't know exactly when we're going to do it. It would probably be within the next year or two. And then I do want to expand it, or we do want to expand it to the rest of the South Atlantic. We just, again, it can be a funding issue. It's not a small task, as I know you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Just another question. This is more venting focused, but just from your experience of just talking to fishermen, do you think that the people that are using the venting method are considered experienced and using the correct gear, or do you think the ones that chose in the survey that they preferred venting, are they maybe using fillet knives or ice picks or something like that? I know that's kind of an open-ended question. I don't know if you have an answer for it, but just what have you been hearing?
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded question. So from what I've seen, just being out on the water with various captains, I can tell you that they are experienced, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're always using the best methods possible. And I know we all know those sort of old salts and whatnot, and some even young salts. That yeah, a fillet, they think that a fillet knife is just as good as anything else. So We didn't get into that in this survey, so I can't give you any official data on that, but from what my eyes have seen on the water, yes, there are people not necessarily doing it correctly, which is why, again, we'd like to really focus on descending device use.
All right, up next is Martha.
Hey, David, it's Martha Gaius at ASA. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So I know there's in the past, there have been a few similar surveys like this well before the regulation went into place. And I feel like a lot of them ask similar questions, maybe not exactly the same. Have you tried to look and see if we're seeing progress in terms of people's recognition and acceptance and use of descending devices?
We did, and I can say that there's progress. It's baby steps, which I guess is still progress. It's not the incremental change that we would have liked. We also had performed this survey as sort of a pre-survey to really our outreach effort, you know, and again, to help us direct our outreach. So the hypothesis was that we were going to get pretty low, not just response rate, but I guess pretty low participation rate with descending device use. And then the idea is that we have our concerted effort, our deck to depth program, which is what we call it, of the descending device outreach. And then the hope is that in a couple of years when we do a follow-up survey, that we'll really see that uptick in use. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And Martha, just to build on that a little bit more, looking back in Red Snapper, I think it was the assessment that was started back in 2014. Fishermen were asked at that point whether or not, at least fishermen that were at the CDAR workshop assessment, whether other fishermen were using descending devices, and they had indicated that very few were using it at that point. So even though it's lower than what David had wanted right now, you know, we are seeing improvements, taking a little bit longer look going back to 2015.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Christina, you're next.
Hey, thanks again, David, for this great presentation. We so appreciate TNC doing some of this work because it's going to be so valuable for the council. I was curious if the sample size was large enough for you to sort of look at regional differences throughout Florida. I know that, you know, North, Central, and Southern Florida can be pretty different, particularly in terms of which fisheries management issues are salient. I didn't know if there was enough data to split it out like that, or if you guys had had a chance to sort of look at regional differences within the state.
Yeah, there was, and a good number of our respondents, I can tell you, came from what I call more North Florida, which, I mean, that's everything to where I live, but sort of that Canaveral to Jacksonville corridor, if you will, maybe a little bit further south as well, but most of our respondents were from sort of that neck of the woods. You know, we would have loved to have an even higher response rate, but doing things via phone and email, you know, I know I don't certainly answer every call that comes my way if it's a number I don't recognize. So, yeah.
All right, any other questions? Judd?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Hey, Judd Curtis, the South Atlantic Council. I did authored a study when I was with the Hart Research Institute with some similar survey questions and kind of respond to Martha's. Yeah, it looks like there's a lot more progress already in just kind of the awareness of descender devices, which is great. One of the things we asked in the survey, you had something similar, was looking at kind of the subsector separation within the rec sector. So, you know, the respondents identified as either private rec or charter or hire or headboat, because we saw some differences, especially with the headboat sector in the responses.
So Judd, you were breaking up a little bit on that. Can you ask
Yeah.
your question again?
Yeah, sorry, I'm at the airport trying to figure this out. My question was, if you asked the respondents what kind of subsector they came from, to see if there's any differences between kind of the private rec anglers, the charter for hire, and the headboat sectors.
So we did differentiate it between what we called the quote unquote professionals, which was a combination of charter and headboat, and then private recreational. And that was broken out in this, which I probably blew through way too quick, and I apologize for that. But there was, there'd be a given slide for private rec and then another one for charter headboat. We combined charter headboat in this survey.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, the results that we had found was that the headboat was a lot more divergent than both the charter and the private rec seemed more similar. And you touched on this a little bit, just the feasibility of implementing widespread use of the center devices when you have so many anglers on board. So yeah, I'd be curious to see moving forward any other differences that can be ascertained from that in these survey types of questions. But thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, Julia, you're next.
Hey, David, hopefully you can hear me. Again, just echoing everybody's thoughts on great presentation, really interesting work. And again, think it would be super valuable to kind of do this type of survey again. And I know you've already talked a little bit about wanting to do it over kind of a broader geographic scale. But I guess my question is a little more open-ended. Are there certain questions that you guys didn't ask in this survey that you think would be really valuable moving forward? So are there things that you didn't ask about where if you were to do this again, you would want to ask about?
That's a good question. And the answer is yes. And then you're probably going to ask me which questions I would want to ask. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I do know that when this first came out and we went through all the round of questioning, and of course it was always after the fact, I'm like, oh, we should have asked this. Oh, we should have asked that. And a smart person would have kept those notes and had it at the ready, but I'm apparently not that guy. But yeah, there were a couple of a little bit more probing questions, but we also wanted to keep this when we did this to less than 10 minutes as a survey. So there were some, unfortunately, that were stuck on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. And I know it's always hard I have to keep a list of those things around. One of the things that I was interested in, did y'all ask about more specifically like where people got descending devices or anything like that to try to get a sense of if they're easily accessible for folks to go out and get in different places? That's something that I think would be of interest to know kind of how accessible they are for people at different tackle shops, or where people are actually getting them in their hands.
We did not, and that was actually one of the questions that ended up on the cutting room floor. But that is a great question to ask. Excuse me. And to that end, I was very disappointingly in Bass Pro Shops down here, and I will throw them under the bus, in Dania/Fort Lauderdale just last weekend, and took a picture because in their display they didn't have any descending devices anymore. They used to have them. They don't have them anymore. They had venting tools, but no descending devices. But yes, that is absolutely a question that we would like to know. Like I said, just in the interest of keeping it to a fairly brief survey, that one didn't make the cut.
So I have a question. I'm not seeing any hands raised right now. You had mentioned that you had asked some different names for things, and I'm wondering, is there a different name for barotrauma that fishermen recognize a little bit easier? I noticed in some of the slides you had floaters. And then the second question is, is there another name for descending devices that fishermen are more familiar with?
So we didn't ask what another name for barotrauma was, but we did find that when we put forth a description and said things like floating and bulging eyes, they were like, oh yeah, I've seen that, and then didn't know what that was called though. So it was sort of either you knew what it was called, bear trauma, or you just knew that the fish wasn't going to make it because it was a floater. So I guess floater would be the second name. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question, Chip?
Is there a different name for descending devices that fishermen might recognize?
We didn't ask that and didn't think to ask that, nor I don't believe we got any respondents about that either.
Okay.
But that is a good question.
Any other questions? Kyle?
Just a couple of comments that I thought this was an excellent presentation, and just so you know, the report has already been really useful filling in gaps of knowledge that we needed filled, and we used the report for recent stock assessment of scamp grouper, so it played a role already in a stock assessment for the council. Back to Julia's question about other questions to ask. One thing that we were interested in for that assessment and had to make some assumptions about was how much of the usage of descender devices was new mitigation versus people transitioning from venting to using descender devices. So that type of question might be, if you go forward with another study in the future, that might be something to ask about.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that.
It's encouraging that it's being used in stock assessments already. So thanks for letting us know, Kyle.
That is very encouraging. Thank you very much, Kyle.
Any other questions? I'll give it just another 30 seconds or so. All right, I'm not seeing any. With that, thank you all very much for attending today, and thank you, David, for presenting. As a reward for you, I did send you a box of chocolates, so hopefully they'll be showing up on your doorstep.
I'll be looking out for them, Chip. And I want to thank the South Atlantic Council in general for not only allowing us to present, certainly Chip, also for participating, helping to participate in the steering committee for this survey. So thank you very much for all your help and effort through this.
Not a problem. Everyone have a good afternoon.
Thank you.